When we talk about military spending, with Carney committing to taking us to 5% of GDP, that will effectively consume all the money for the next 10 years. And already they're talking about the cutbacks that there will have to be through all the other areas of government. And I would argue that if we're concerned about standing up to Donald Trump, which we are and should be, the way to strengthen ourselves isn't through a military buildup that we could never possibly compete with the Americans on. The way to do that is to strengthen our notion of ourselves as a country.
It's been over 100 days since Mark Carney and his Liberal Party won what many pundits are calling the most consequential federal election in Canada in decades, falling just a few seats short of an outright majority. During the 36-day campaign, the former central banker and Wall Street titan presented himself as an ardent defender of Canadian political and economic independence. Is Mark Carney living up to the expectations of the millions of Canadians who voted for his party? Is the Oxford and Harvard-trained man of destiny meeting the moment? Is he delivering the goods? I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. In the days and weeks before Election Day, Mark Carney insisted he was a nation builder, committed to strengthening Canada's democratic institutions, tearing down provincial trade barriers, standing up for progressive Canadian values, and warding off attacks from hostile foreign actors. Since coming to office, the newly elected Carney-led Liberal government has promised a multi-billion-dollar boost in military spending, tax cuts, and the fast-tracking of resource and infrastructure projects. Liberal cabinet ministers have been ordered to find up to 15% in savings in their departments in advance of this fall's budget. The idea is to reinvest the savings in housing, defense, and infrastructure. But critics argue that Carney's proposal is nothing more than a radical austerity plan, and that the Liberal cuts will lead to the elimination of a raft of government programs and services, the loss of tens of thousands of public sector jobs, and a rise in social inequality. They say that all this amounts to the defunding of the state and is a betrayal of the voters who supported Carney and the Liberals on April 28th. Joining me to assess Prime Minister Mark Carney's and the Liberal government's first 100 days in office is Linda McQuaig, an award-winning journalist, novelist, best-selling author, and contributing columnist to the Toronto Star. Her most recent book is called The Sport and Prey of Capitalists: How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth. Linda McQuaig, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Great to be here. I mean, it's not great to be in bed with the elephant, but you know what I mean.
Well, it's great to meet you. It's great to meet you finally. After years, many years of reading your work, it's a delight to have you with us.
Well, it's an honor to meet you.
Linda, it's been 3 months since Mark Carney and the Liberal Party won a convincing victory in the April 28th federal election. They won 169 seats, just 3 seats short of a majority. What's your assessment of Mark Carney and his new Liberal government so far?
I'd have to start by saying that, first of all, like many people, I was so glad that he managed to block Pierre Poilievre from becoming our prime minister, which truly would have been a terrible disaster for the country. Having said that, I am somewhat disappointed. I think what we saw in Carney was a very impressive, bright former governor of the Bank of England, Bank of Canada, patriot, willing to stand up to Donald Trump. And all that is still true. But I'm disappointed in some of the things he's done, however, so far.
I did want to get your sense as to why you think Canadians supported him. Like, what were they voting for? What were they expecting from Mark Carney?
Well, again, I think a huge amount of it was, resistance to Poilievre and a desire to block Poilievre. That became particularly clear after all the Trump re-election and Trump aggression towards Canada. And it reminded people that Poilievre is somewhat Trump-like. He doesn't have the kind of territorial aggression that Trump has, but he has the bit of a MAGA mentality, let's face it.
What does that mean in particular, like in detail?
It means a phony populism. That's the idea of appealing to ordinary people and championing the cause of ordinary people. That's not what MAGA or Poilievre is all about. They're about championing the interests of the wealthy that support them. Poilievre became very skilled, however, at winning over blue-collar workers in Canada, as if he was going to stand up for them. In fact, what he would have done was, strip away all our important social programs, strip them down to the bone, champion ever more tax cuts, tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy. Very similar in many ways to the MAGA agenda, without all the immigration hostility that we see south of the border. But anyway, I think Canadians never liked that agenda particularly. It became particularly clear just how ugly an agenda it was, partly due to the re-election of Trump. And I think what happened was that the Trudeau government had become so hated, to a certain extent unfairly, I think. That was something very much pushed by the business community and the business media. And, after 10 years in power, people were dissatisfied with aspects. And there were various questions of corruption connected with Trudeau. So there was this visceral dislike of Trudeau in the population that was sort of benefiting Poilievre. But then when Carney came on the scene, the whole picture changed, and just overnight, you could see Carney's numbers soaring. So I think it was pretty clear that Trudeau had become very unpopular for a number of reasons. It wasn't that Canadians were so supportive of Poilievre and the Conservatives. And as soon as there was sort of a viable alternative that people saw in Carney, they immediately went to it.
Is there any difference between the Liberals and Conservatives?
Yeah. Oh, there is. Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
Because many of the policies that Mark Carney has put forward as proposed, some would suggest that Pierre Poilievre probably would have done the same.
I'm sure Poilievre would have done some of the same things. There's fundamentally different approaches in the two parties. I do think that the whole concept of the Conservative Party has been kind of warped into this notion of helping ordinary people. But in fact, that's just a ruse. It's really all about helping the very rich.
But maybe the Carney agenda is a ruse. Maybe the Carney government is really a right-wing government in center-left close. That Mark Carney is advancing a right-wing economic agenda of cuts. He's proposing the downsizing of public services. Some might even say beyond the wildest dreams of conservatives. And that the cuts that he's proposing exceed even what Stephen Harper had done years back.
It is true that Mark Carney has come out much more conservative and leaning to the right than we saw during the election. And so far, I'm very, disturbed by some of those tendencies. I do think he and Poilievre are fundamentally different. The whole contempt that Poilievre showed for the media.
So it's really style then.
It's really style,
Lynn McQuaig. It's not substance.
No. It is more than style. It is also substance. But it's certainly, Poilievre had a kind of contempt for democratic accountability and the whole process of government. But I am disturbed about the extent to which Carney is leaning rightward. And I think to some extent, it's true that the business community is just so excited by what they see Carney doing. They're just so thrilled at the idea of all this military spending. And of course, what you see happening is the business community is totally behind all that military spending. And they're arguing what they always argue, which is the way we're going to pay for it is by cutting government spending. First of all, as you know, I disagree with that military spending target, but I do believe in investing in national projects that are worthwhile. And I do believe that, that's going to involve some kind of shared commitment or shared sacrifice on the part of Canadians to build some of those things. But I find it outrageous that the business community is promoting, they want all this military spending, but they want ordinary Canadians to pay for it. They don't want business or the rich to pay for it. As Andrew Coyne was pointing out in a column last week, he's all in favor of all this military spending. And he's saying, well, some people will argue the rich should pay for it, but there just aren't enough rich people to pay for it. Well, that's a pretty disingenuous comment from a smart guy like Andrew Coyne. There may not be many rich people in this country, but there are some fabulously wealthy people at the top. And there's a huge, huge amount of wealth accumulated at the top. In fact, that's one of the biggest stories that never gets the attention it deserves, which is the extent to which inequality is increasing in this country. And all the money in recent years, particularly since the pandemic, increasingly goes to the very top. We need to tax the wealthy, certainly to pay for the military spending or whatever other important national projects we engage in. The very wealthy almost escape taxation. They are able to avoid paying income taxes in many cases. So we have an incredible need for a wealth tax in this country, and it could raise billions of dollars. But do you see the business community embracing that as a solution? No, because they don't want, they want the shared sacrifice to be paid for by the ordinary Canadians, not by wealthy Canadians.
Why are you so concerned about the military spending? Because the truth is that Mark Carney comes into power facing a real crisis. A crisis which involves Canada's neighbor, the United States, threatening its sovereignty. And one could make the argument that reinvesting in the military is a way of showing that Canada is willing to defend its borders. And it's willing to do what it needs to do in order to at least demonstrate a commitment to national security and a commitment to some of its relationships in NATO. So what's wrong with this push to increase military spending in this country?
Okay, well, first of all, when you talk about defending our borders, I assume, your reference there is to the United States. Is that the level we want to be competing or defending ourselves from the United States? The military level? That is a contest that we will never win. Okay, the U.S. is by far the biggest military, most powerful military in the world, plus nuclear armed and everything. There's absolutely no way, if it's going to come down to a U.S. invasion, no amount of military spending on our part is going to defend us from that.
But Linda, in a world in which Canada's allies in Europe are also having to increase the amount of money that they're spending on the military, in a world in which Donald Trump is pushing Canada, demanding that Canada increase its spending to demonstrate its commitment to the alliance, does Canada have any other choice?
Yes, it does. And for instance, I'm all in favor of strengthening our ties with Europe. I think that's so important. But why do it on the military level? Why not strengthen our trade ties, strengthen our commitment to international law, strengthen our commitment to action on climate change, which the Europeans are so much more advanced on than we are? I would argue that we should be using our voice within NATO to argue for less military spending. The way to deal with the crises in the world is not more military spending, it's more international diplomacy, more cooperation, more understanding. Look, these things are difficult to achieve, I admit, and we have to be able to help Ukraine defend itself when Russia invades. But I'm just saying, in a broader way, what we need to do is focus more on peace, international cooperation, international development, to just sort of put all this effort and energy about building a stronger military. I think that's a crazy idea for the world, not just for Canada. We should be moving away from that.
You say it's crazy, but those who support the idea say it's realistic. We live in a much more difficult environment today, and that it's incumbent upon Canada to demonstrate that it is serious about its security and that it is serious about its commitment to an alliance like NATO. And the fact is that the NATO alliance is in peril, that the United States is threatening to withdraw, and the Europeans are very intent on keeping the United States in the fold. And so Canada contributing a minimum amount, or upwards of 5% of its GDP to the military, it strengthens that alliance.
Again, I would argue that the whole focus on everything being military and solving our problems through military action is just fundamentally wrong. And yes, there's all kinds of voices out there arguing for that. They always argue for that. We have so many urgent problems in the world today. Military solutions are not the answer to them. I would like to see, for instance, much more focus on nuclear disarmament. Apart from the climate threat, the whole nuclear threat is just so dangerous, and it gets virtually no attention. But I would also want to point out, when we talk about military spending, with Carney committing to taking us to 5% of GDP, that will effectively consume all the money for the next 10 years. And already they're talking about the cutbacks that there will have to be through all the other areas of government. Well, why should the government's top priority be the military? We want strong public programs in this country. And I would argue that if we're concerned about standing up to Donald Trump, which we are and should be, the way to strengthen ourselves isn't through a military buildup that we could never possibly compete with the Americans on. The way to do that is to strengthen our notion of ourselves as a country. We do that by building a stronger sense of national unity, but you don't do that just through military spending. One of my favorite ideas is we have to get back into public enterprise in this country. And by that, I mean publicly owned by the people, institutions and programs and companies that can provide things for Canadians. So, for instance, we used to have Connaught Labs in this country. Connaught Labs was publicly owned by the government ultimately, and it was a major manufacturer of drugs and vaccines that was one of the best in the world at what it did. Connaught Labs was responsible for the Banting and Best and the discovery of insulin. It was responsible for developing vaccines at an incredibly cheap price and sold them all over the world. Unfortunately, like so many other things, we privatized Connaught Labs in the 1980s, and as a result, we have no company like that. When COVID came along, we were unable to provide our own vaccines. If we want to strengthen the notion of Canada, let's get back into doing things like that really could make a difference in the world and pull the country together and give it a sense of pride.
Mark Carney and his supporters are going to say that the bill that they're proposing, Bill C-5, also known as the One Canadian Economy Act, which aims to break down interprovincial trade and employment barriers, is about building Canadian unity, is about pulling the country together by increasing trade within the country. How do you respond to that proposal, Bill C-5? What do you think of that act?
I am in favor of a more united market, like Canada being one market. I've always found it questionable, for instance, that you go into the liquor store in Ontario and you can't, at least I can't seem to find them, BC wines. Now you can't get American wines either, but you used to be able to get all kinds of fantastic wines from California, but nothing from the BC Okanagan Valley. I don't get that. By all means, let's try and pull our market together as much as we can. But there's been an attempt to suggest that that alone is going to, make us fabulously wealthy. I think the benefits are more limited than has been suggested. And also, different provinces have different levels of regulations in different areas, and that there's some fear that by making this pressure for all provinces to have the same regulations might kind of create a downward pressure to sort of minimize regulations. Sometimes regulations are important. Regulations are presumably put there to protect the public interest. And, business is always keen to eliminate those regulations. So I think you have to be careful that we don't end up with the lowest common denominator of regulations.
Although Mark Carney is going to say that, yes, there is the need for regulation, but sometimes maybe there are too many regulations. It has hindered progress in this country, and that one of the reasons why he's proposing that the government fast-track projects is to make sure that government gets out of the way and that businesses can actually do what they do best.
If there's regulations that are getting in the way needlessly, let's get rid of them. But let's not get on this idea that regulations are automatically bad. I mean, the reason that regulations are put in place, presumably, are to protect the public. And often that's what they do. And there's no question that business and private interests often want to remove regulations that are valid and should be in place. And I'm concerned about all this fast tracking of projects if it's going to compromise aspects of our democracy that are important. Consultation with Indigenous people, giving them a fair voice in things, and various climate considerations, environmental considerations. I think our democratic process is more important in preserving than any mega project may be. More important is that we keep our democratic system functional. And if that involves important protections that have been built in, then we need those protections. That's part of our democratic system. That is truly what makes us a great country.
How important is it for Mark Carney to protect the trading relationship with the United States?
Obviously, the United States is an important trading partner. It is our key trading partner, so it obviously requires a great deal of focus. I wouldn't doubt that. At the same time, the idea of connecting more with other countries is absolutely correct. And people have argued this for years. We've been far too dependent on the U.S. as our market, and that's to our detriment. I mean, it's particularly clear now when Trump is just out of control half the time. But it's always been true. It's always been true that we're far too acquiescent to the demands of Americans. Governments always try and pretend that they do things for independent reasons, but the Canadian government typically succumbs to requests from the U.S. in order to please the U.S. because it's such an important trading partner. I mean, when Chrétien decided not to send Canadian troops to Iraq, that was very unusual. That's not typically what Canadian governments do. It's very good that there's going to be a focus more on connecting to other countries around the world. That will strengthen our hand also in dealing with the U.S. generally, in terms of trade and in terms of other things as well.
And yet the reality is that, 70% of Canada's trade is with the United States? The reality is that Canada is dealing with a very mercurial, erratic president in President Donald Trump, unpredictable. Let's just talk about the digital sales tax. Canada recently rescinded the digital sales tax after Donald Trump called off trade talks in retaliation for the levy. And he said unless Canada lifted the digital services tax, he was going to stop the trading conversation. He said that the digital sales tax was a blatant attack on the United States and that Canada is a very difficult country to trade with. Did Canada have any choice? When it comes to the digital sales tax, did Mark Carney not have to rescind it?
He did not have to. He had a choice. He made the wrong decision in my mind,
Why?
Clearly.
Why?
Well, first of all, the digital sales tax is a vital tax because otherwise we have no way to properly tax these great big tech companies, Google and Meta. They are consuming so much of the advertising market in our country, making it difficult for other media to compete with them. And yet they escape taxation because they're located outside the country. The tax was absolutely necessary. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It's been for years in the making. And the European countries, they have the same concept of taxing these digital giants. And if anything, I think we undermined the European efforts to do that by immediately capitulating to Trump on this.
And yet you were willing to risk the trading relationship with the United States?
Yes, because look at Donald Trump is an extremely volatile, not very thoughtful human being. He can do anything at any point. He can yell, he can threaten anything. You can't just assume that everything he's saying is true. And I think, if anything, it just showed such weakness. Like, he says that, and then we just immediately cut the tax. No, to immediately just capitulate, I think that completely sends the wrong message.
So you hold on to the tax, and he says, I'm not going to talk with you anymore.
Well, he will, though. He will, because...
Well, but how do you know that, Linda McQuaig? It's easy for you to say you're on the sidelines, Linda McQuaig. Like
I don't know anything,
it's very easy for you to speak.
Else.
But it's very easy for you to take shots and to speak.
Yeah.
You're not in the room. You're not part of the negotiating team. You don't realize what they have to deal with.
I agree with you. I'm simply saying nobody has any idea what Donald Trump is going to do. Okay? We simply don't know. Like Mark Carney saying certain things are not on the table. Why was this one on the table? What if Donald Trump said, okay, if you don't immediately hand over the Great Lakes to the United States, there'll be no further trade talks. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing to prevent him from saying anything. Like,
giving up on the digital sales tax isn't the same on giving up on sovereignty over the Great Lakes.
Well, okay, but just a second. The digital sales tax is actually important, and it's a matter of principle. Right now, Trump is telling Brazil he's imposed some extraordinary tax on them because he's angry at the way the Brazilian government is prosecuting a particular case.
Jair Bolsonaro.
Yeah. Well,
right. Who's an ally of Donald Trump?
Quite rightly, Lula, the Brazilian government, is saying, no, you can't do that. Are we going to allow Donald Trump to come up and tell us what cases we can try and what cases we can't? Like, that's just chaos and insanity. You just can't do that. And the truth is, there are pressures on Trump. He says a lot of crazy things that he never follows through on. But we just capitulated just like that. And did it help us? Apparently it didn't make any difference.
So what do you make of Mark Carney talking about elbows up during the campaign? Is he living up to that commitment, that idea that he was going to defend the interests of Canada and Canadians?
Look, there's no doubt the negotiations going on with the U.S. are extremely complicated. And I have every reason to believe that he is trying to defend Canada and that, it's not easy. I guess I'm just saying that I think there are other ways that he could strengthen Canada, which is vital, that would be more important than capitulating. See, I would argue that he capitulated as well on the military spending. It gets us nothing, and it completely forces us to kind of redo our priorities as a country. We shouldn't be forced into that position.
You suggest that there's a difference in terms of substance between the Liberals and Conservatives. I would contend that an organization like Amnesty International is going to disagree with you, Linda McQuaig, because they're going to say the strong borders bill that the federal government is proposing, the Bill C-2, would, and this is just quoting from Amnesty International, would make it virtually impossible for most people entering Canada via the U.S. to have their refugee claim reviewed by the Immigration and Refugee Board. In addition, the bill would effectively block people who've been in Canada for more than a year from seeking refugee status. People who face persecution, torture, or worse in their countries of origin could be unfairly denied refugee protection by Canada as a result. That sounds like a conservative policy.
Yes, and there are things that the Carney government is doing that are very alarming. I'm not willing at this point to say they're as bad as Poilievre, but there has been a disappointing move to the right. Let's just take something like the whole Palestinian issue. There's something that I think is very important, okay? There's a clear difference between the liberals and the conservatives in their approach to the whole Middle East, and particularly the situation in Gaza, which is horrific and gets far too little attention. The Carney government, in one of its very early acts, came out and did a joint statement with France and Britain, really seriously attacking the Israeli government for what it's doing in Gaza, calling its actions egregious.
But they're not calling it genocide.
Okay, but they are absolutely demanding that it stop.
On July 30th, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would recognize a Palestinian state during the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025, provided that the Palestinian state hold an election in 2026 with no involvement by Hamas and commit to demilitarization. What do you make of Mark Carney's announcement?
I do think it's the right thing that he's come out and said that Canada will recognize a Palestinian state. I think that's a very important development. You know, you can argue, of course, it should have come sooner or should have come years ago. But if we're talking about Carney and his role, I would say that is a good thing. And this actually follows up on other things that he's done, which have broken from the way the Trudeau government handled the Middle East and taken a stronger stand. While I would criticize the Carney government for not going farther, not being more forceful in its denunciation of what Israel is doing in Gaza, I do think this is an important step. It does illustrate the difference between Carney and Poilievre. Poilievre is just so militantly pro-Israel in all ways, so indifferent to the rights of the Palestinians, whereas Carney has taken a much tougher stand against Israel. Not tough enough, given what's happening, but very, very different than what we're seeing from Poilievre.
Should Canada be halting all shipments of ammunition to Israel?
Absolutely, it should be. There should be no shipments of any kind of armaments going to Israel at this point, when it is carrying out activities that are clearly genocidal in Gaza and have been identified that way by human rights groups and by Israeli scholars of genocide. I mean, what is going on is so horrific. We have to absolutely cut off all armaments immediately.
The other day, in a press conference with Prime Minister Carney, the CTV reporter Judy Trin posed the question as to whether Canada would be trying to assist the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in apprehending Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been charged with war crimes by the ICC. Do you think Canada should be pursuing Netanyahu?
Well, certainly, if he comes onto our soil, we should cooperate with the ICC. This is a court that we have respected and supported over the years and played an important role in. And our obligation as members of the international community is to uphold international law. So that requires us to act on indictments that are brought in the International Criminal Court. So absolutely, as with any action by the International Criminal Court, as a member of it, we must support it. And if that involves arresting Netanyahu, absolutely.
And yet, if Canada were to take that step, would it not put it offside President Trump, who suggested that Canada's treatment of Israel could end up affecting trade relations with the United States?
So be it. So be it.
Linda McQuaig, I think we'll have to end it there, but thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adrian. A real pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.